Today we are going to talk about the peptic ulcer. The peptic ulcer, or it is also called as the acid peptic disease, means the ulcer lesions. Acid peptic disease means the ulcer lesions found in the areas of the alimentary tract. Alimentary tract means from mouth to the anal region, and that area that's supposed to expose to the acid and pepsin. That's why the name is the peptic ulcer or acid peptic disease, and that includes the gastric ulcers, duodenal ulcers, and reflux esophagitis or GERD, that is the gastroesophageal reflux disease. Now, when we call as ulcer, whenever there is a breach in the continuity of the GI mucous membrane or the GI mucosa, breach in the continuity of the mucous membrane, as you can see here, there is a, in the picture there is a peptic ulcer disease. As you can see in the picture, there is a ulcer. Ulcer means it's a breach in the continuity of the GI mucous membrane or the GI mucosa, and there is a development of the peptic ulcer. Now, the prevalence rate is 3 to 5% and more in males than females. The peptic ulcer prevalence rate more in males than in females. We know the reason. Why? Because of lifestyle, because of the alcohol intake, because of the spicy food. So all these factors makes more, what we can say, they are more prevalent for the peptic ulcer. Now we'll see the how this hydrochloric acid or gastric juice is secreted. There are three phases for the secretion of the gastric juice. Now for that, cephalic phase means whenever see some delicious food or whenever there is some smell of some delicious food, what will happen? It send impulses, sensory impulses, it send impulses to the cerebral cortex, and from cerebral cortex it send conditioned reflex to the hypothalamus and medulla oblongata, and through the vagus nerve to the 10th cranial nerve it stimulates the secretory activity of the stomach, or HCl is secreted. Means sight or thought of food, it send impulses to the higher centers like cerebral cortex, and through cerebral cortex it goes to the hypothalamus and medulla oblongata, and with the help of 10th cranial nerve or the vagus nerve there is an increase in the HCl secretion or gastric juice secretion. That is a cephalic phase. But in contrast, if there is a loss of appetite, or and when there is a loss of appetite, whenever you are in depression, when you are in a bad mood or there is a sad feeling, same impulse goes to the cerebral cortex. There is a lack of stimulation to the parasympathetic center, because rest and digest, eating food, digestion, it's a function of the parasympathetic system, but that system is not stimulated, and that's why it inhibits the stomach secretory activity of the, means it inhibits the stomach secretory activity, right? This is the cephalic phase. Now there is a gastric phase. Now what happens in a gastric phase? There is a stomach distension which activates the stretch receptor. Stomach will distend. Why? Because food enter into your stomach through the food pipe or through the esophagus. So stomach distension, that will activate the stretch receptor, and because of that there is a two reflexes, either vasovagal reflex or local reflex generated. That local reflex directly stimulates the stomach secretory activity, or vasovagal reflex through the medulla, again with the help of vagus nerve, it stimulates your HCl secretion. Or food chemicals and rising pH activates the chemoreceptor. Food chemicals means there is a breakdown of carbohydrates, proteins, fats. So there is a release of food chemicals, and there is a rising pH. There is a rising pH which activates the chemoreceptor, and because of that G cells secrete gastrin into the blood, and this G cell which secrete gastrin is responsible for the stimulation of the HCl. So this is the gastric phase. Now, in contrast, if you are having hyperacidity, excessive acidity means pH is less than 2 in your stomach. So what will happen? Gastrin secretion will decline. Or if you are in emotional distress, like you are depressed, or if you are anxious, if there's some tension, so what will happen? If you are anxious, then your sympathetic nervous system will be activated. That will override parasympathetic system, and ultimately it inhibits the stomach secretory activity. That will inhibit the HCl secretion if you are in a stress. Okay. Now intestinal phase. Now what happens in the intestinal phase? Presence of low pH and partially digested food into duodenum as the stomach empties. Means food escape from stomach to the duodenum. Now in that phase what happens? Intestinal gastrin release into the blood. Intestinal gastrin, and that will further stimulate the stomach secretory activity. Okay, this is the intestinal phase. But in contrast, if there is a distension of duodenum, or presence of fatty acidic hypertonic chyme or irritants, so because of the distension of the duodenum or presence of some fatty acidic hypertonic chyme, that will stimulate the local reflexes. There is a stimulation of the pyrolic sphincter, and because of that pyrolic sphincter stimulation, there is an enterogastric reflex is generated, and because of that it inhibits the stomach secretory activity. Means basically what happens? Distension of duodenum or presence of fatty acidic partially digested food, that will releases the various hormones like secretin, gastrin, or not gastrin, it's a gastric inhibitory peptide, cholecystokinin, CCK, or vasoactive intestinal peptide. All these hormones are responsible for the inhibition of the stomach secretory activity. So this is what is the intestinal phase. Now this is how the HCl is secreted. There are three phases. First is the cephalic phase, then second is the gastric phase, and third is the intestinal phase. Now we'll see what are the various cells which are present in the gastric mucosa and what are the various functions. Now, first of all, the cell type is the parietal cell. Parietal cell is very important, and this parietal cell will secrete the HCl. And what is the function of HCl? It will kill microbes and activates the pepsinogen. Parietal cell is responsible for the secretion of HCl, and this HCl will kill all the microbes, pathogenic microorganisms, and it also activates the pepsinogen, which is responsible for the pepsin. Now, parietal cell also secretes the intrinsic factor, and this intrinsic factor binds with vitamin B12 and helps in the absorption of vitamin B12. Okay, intrinsic factor. Now there is a presence of chief cells. Chief cells is responsible for the pepsinogen, which is responsible for the protein digestion. Chief cells also secrete gastric lipase, which is responsible for the fat digestion. Right? Now G cell, it secretes gastrin. It will stimulate your HCl secretion. Enterochromaffin cells, it stimulates or it secretes the histamine, which is also responsible for HCl secretion. Or mucous neck cells, which is responsible for mucus and bicarbonate secretion. It will protect stomach epithelium from acid. Mucous neck cells, they secrete mucus and bicarbonate, and they will form a protective layer. If they form protective layer, so what they do? It protect stomach epithelium or GI mucosa from the acid. Now D cells will secrete somatostatin, which inhibit the gastric acid secretion. which inhibits the gastric acid secretion. So these are the various different types of cells like parietal cell, chief cell, G cells, enterochromaffin cells, ECL cells, mucous neck cells or D cells. Now we have seen what are the various things they will secrete and what are the various functions of these cells. Means in the this diagram you will also see the various types of cells, like this is the parietal cell, this is the mucous neck cell, this is the chief cell. Okay, so these are the different types of cells which are present in the gastric pit. Now what is the pathophysiology? The etiology of the acid peptic disease is incompletely understood. It is not very well understood. The stomach secrete about 2 to 3 liters of gastric acid per day. HCl secretion is 2 to 3 liters per day. But in 80% of the patients, colonization of the H. pylori is implicated in the pathogenesis of peptic ulcer. H. pylori, Helicobacter pylori, is responsible for 80% of cases. Okay, because there is a colonization of the H. pylori in the gastric mucosa. Now, there is one more reason. Imbalance between aggressive luminal factors. There is imbalance. Imbalance between what? Between aggressive luminal factors like acid and pepsin and defensive mucosal factors like mucus, bicarbonate, prostaglandin, blood fluid of mucosa. These are the causative mechanism for the peptic ulcer. Now you'll understand better. These are the protective factors. And these are the aggressive factors. Protective factors in the green, that will protect your mucosa, GI mucosa, like prostaglandin. It will protect the mucosa. Then mucus, bicarbonate, which is secreted by the mucus-like cells. Mucosal blood flow. The more the mucosal blood flow, it will protect your GI mucosa. It will make strength, or it will strengthen your GI mucosa. Then GI mucosa, gastric mucosa itself, it will act like a protective factor. These are the protective one. And aggressive one. Aggressive means they are responsible for the ulcers like HCl, pepsin, bile acid, or the drugs like NSAIDs, and the microorganisms like H. pylori. These are the aggressive factors. So, imbalance between these factors, protective factors and aggressive factor, there is a there is the occurrence of peptic ulcer. If there is an imbalance between these two factors, if they are in balance, then there will be no formation of ulcers. But if there is an imbalance between these two things, either in a protective factor or in an aggressive factor, so there is a occurrence of the peptic ulcer. Now, what is the role of prostaglandin in the peptic ulcer? Prostaglandin, we'll see, mucous neck cells, they secrete mucus and bicarbonate, and when they secrete mucus and bicarbonate, they form a protective layer. And which protect GI mucosa from HCl. PGI2 and PGE2, prostacyclin, PGI2 means prostacyclin, and PGE2 stimulate the secretion of mucus and bicarbonate. So they act on the prostaglandin receptor, which is present on the parietal cells, and they inhibit the gastric secretion. It also causes vasodilatation. Okay, so this is the role of prostaglandin, how it protects the GI mucosa by secreting mucus and bicarbonate. They form a protective layer over the gastric mucosa. Now, we will see how gastric acid is produced. Now, these are the factors responsible for the etiopathogenesis of the peptic ulcer.